Hello there. According to the Office for Budget Responsibility, the UK economy could end up losing 2 million jobs and shrink by more than a third as a result of the global healthcare crisis. Firstly, as ever, please kick that YouTube algorithm up the rear by giving this video a big fat like, and I'm always uploading new content, so please do check my YouTube channel daily. Now, although the government spending watchdog, the Office for Budget Responsibility, or OBR, has put forward some hugely depressing figures today, it must be stressed that this is a reference scenario, not a prediction, and it is also saying that the UK economy will quickly rebound after we clear 2020. Now, the OBR reference scenario is based on the current lockdown lasting a total of 3 months, and is then followed by a more relaxed lockdown lasting another 3 months. And what the OBR is saying is that in the second quarter of the year, that's April, May and June, based on this scenario, the UK would see a 35% reduction in real GDP and a loss of 2 million jobs to take the unemployment rate to 10%. It is also saying that, were the reference scenario to unfold, then our net borrowing for the year to April 2021 would increase by £218 billion to become, at 14% of GDP, the largest single-year deficit since the Second World War. And this will take the UK total net debt to about 100% of GDP. Now, the economic downturn in terms of GDP will hit different sectors of the economy in different ways. For example, from this chart, you can see that manufacturing could be hit with as much as 55% of output losses, while the construction industry takes a 70% hit, but education gets shafted with 90%. But the overall effect, taking into account the different weightings that each sector has with regard to the whole economy, then the total output loss in the second quarter this year would be 35%. But remember, that is if this reference scenario holds. And this graph shows the impact of this crisis on UK GDP in comparison with other notable events in history. The left-hand side of the graph shows the beginning of the 20th century, and you can see the dip in GDP caused by the First World War and the outbreak of Spanish flu. Then comes the Great Depression, which had less of an effect on the UK than it did on the US. After that came the Second World War, and the next big downturn after that was the 2008 credit crunch. Now, to the right-hand side of the graph, you can see a short green line, which represents the OBR predictions of positive growth made before the healthcare crisis raised its ugly head. The red line, though, represents the effect on the UK economy's GDP if the reference scenario is followed. And this shows that for the whole of 2020, GDP will drop by 12.8%. And as far as I can see from the economic definitions, that is a depression, not a recession. But the International Monetary Fund has decided to call this situation the Great Lockdown, although it has said that this will be the worst recession since the Great Depression. But due to the provisions put in place by the government, it looks like the OBR scenario shows that in 2021, as shown by the red line, the UK will bounce back with a 17.9% increase in GDP, and then in 2022 it will come back into line with previous OBR predictions. Although strangely, as far as I can see from the figures, that would mean that in pure terms of pounds, the UK economy would have grown bigger by 2022 with this crisis than without it. I'll have to check my maths on that one. And when looking at this on a quarter-by-quarter basis, the OBR shows that quarter 2 of 2020 would have a 35% drop, but that most of the recovery would take place in quarter 3 with a 27% boost and in quarter 4 with a 21% boost. But it's the employment that we'll have to keep our eyes on. As you can see from this next graph, the unemployment rate is expected to go to 10% this second quarter of the year and then fall back to about 7% by the end of the year before slowly tailing off in the coming years. One thing to note is that although we will take a short-term plunge in GDP, far greater than that seen previously, the OBR's model shows that our public sector net borrowing will be nowhere near the over 25% of GDP that we saw in the two world wars, although it will spike larger than that seen during the credit crunch, but only for 1 year. And although our total net debt will get to the level of about 95% of GDP next year, the OBR reference scenario shows it could tail back quite quickly to 85% by 2025, compared to the 80-odd% we saw just before the crisis hit us. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Rishi Sunak, told the BBC that the OBR report was just one potential scenario, but that the crisis will have a very significant impact on our economy. People should know there is hardship ahead. Now, the IMF, in its first World Economic Outlook since the start of the crisis, where it talks about this as the Great Lockdown, said that things could get worse if a second wave hits. And IMF chief economist Geeta Gopinath said, "This crisis is like no other. First, the shock is large. The output loss associated with this health emergency and related containment measures likely dwarfs the losses that triggered the global financial crisis. Second, like in a war or a political crisis, there is continued severe uncertainty about the duration and intensity of the shock. Third, under current circumstances, there is a very different role for economic policy. In normal crises, policymakers try to encourage economic activity by stimulating aggregate demand as quickly as possible. This time, the crisis is to a large extent the consequence of needed containment measures. This makes stimulating activity more challenging and, at least for the most affected sectors, undesirable." So we have a reference scenario from the OBR of a 3-month lockdown and a 3-month easing prior to getting back to as near as normal as we can, and the IMF putting out some cautionary words. But those not receiving state aid in the UK don't have the luxury of time. And to put this in context, IPSE, the Association of Independent Professionals and the Self-Employed, has said today that nearly half of self-employed fear they will not have enough money to cover basic costs despite government support. IPSE research shows that 45% of the self-employed fear they will not have enough money to cover basic costs like rent and bills during this crisis, despite the government support on offer. Overall, 2/3 say that they are worried that they will burn through all their savings in the next 3 months. And also that although there is now a range of support available for freelancers, nearly 2/3 say it is not enough to sustain their business and their income through the crisis. And IPSE comes up with some recommendations. Include dividend income in the job retention scheme to help limited company directors. Temporarily relax the universal credit application criteria for self-employed people waiting for the Self-Employment Income Support Scheme, or SEISS, grant in June. Extend the SEISS scheme to the newly self-employed by letting them file an early tax return before the end of April. Introduce a taper above the £50,000 salary threshold for the SEISS. Andy Chamberlain, Director of Policy at IPSE, said, "This research shows that it is not just a few self-employed people falling through the cracks in government support. Right across the sector, freelancers are facing dire financial damage." And Ben Wilmot, The head of public policy at the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development, the CIPD, said, "This research demonstrates starkly the huge impact of the crisis on the self-employed and the financial distress and hardship it is causing. It also clearly shows more still needs to be done to help those who fall through the gaps in the support available through either the job retention scheme or the income support scheme for the self-employed. We are still a while away from getting back to anywhere near normal. But if the OBR is in the right ballpark, then we could see a sharp dip followed by a sharp recovery. But only if we can keep the workforce left idle by all this and the general consumers both in a solvent enough position to pump prime an economic recovery. We cannot leave people behind. And that is the Chancellor's job." Now, although China may be the bogeyman at present, it was the first in and the first out of a lockdown and is now posting a trade surplus according to the Financial Times. And the Wall Street Journal says that although Chinese exports fell by 6.6% in March compared to last year, it was less of a drop than pundits expected. So maybe a V-shaped rebound is on the cards. Let's keep our fingers crossed on that one. Anyway, if you want to hear more from me, please don't forget to subscribe and also press that little bell, or you won't get any notifications. And if you want to see more of me, buy a mug with my mug on it. So, what do you think about all of this? Please share and comment, and thank you for watching.